ironically, in the very male-dominated culture I grew up in, and I should say that Malta is different today. There are many opportunities for women. But as a product of the 60s, who graduated from college in 73, there were very few options open for women. In my male-dominated culture, in which women were basically voiceless, the figure of Mary was extraordinarily important. And I'd like to address an issue which is a little confusing to people. How is Mary so important? And why is she so important in Christianity, especially in Southern European Catholicism? The answer is not to be found in Scripture. In fact, if we look at the scriptural record, Mary, in fact, does not even understand her son's role. And we are told in one particular place, I think it's in Mark 3, that Mary and Jesus' brothers and sisters went to take him home because they thought he was out of his mind. So clearly there were places where Mary does not understand what Jesus was all about, and that his relatives, in fact, tried to stop him in his mission. We, of course, know of Mary's yes in agreeing to be the mother of the Christ child, which is perhaps an incredible example of unconditional submission to God, of unconditional service, of unconditional courage. But then after that, there isn't much until her standing at the foot of the cross. Clearly, there isn't enough to justify this incredible power that we find manifested in festivals all over Europe, as well as in Latin America. I think in Malta, for example, of December the 8th, and I often take student groups over to Malta at that time, not only to see the megalithic temples, but also to experience a Marian festival, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is the feast that Mary was conceived without any stain of sin. And at this festival, there are not only the usual firework displays and marching bands and all the colour and pageantry that you find in festas in Malta all year round, but there is a statue of exquisite beauty made of sterling silver, which is processed through the streets at nightfall. She must weigh, a couple of tons, I would say. It takes about 6 men to carry her through the streets, if not more. And she is processed through the streets with all the people following behind, as well as the marching bands. And you will see men throwing themselves in front of the statue, on their knees, weeping, declaring her beauty, praying in poetry, asking for her assistance. It is truly remarkable to see enormous men, some covered with tattoos, some looking as though they're quite tough. And there they are, as I said, with tears down their eyes, rolling down their faces, honoring the Divine Mother. I've taken groups consisting of Christians, Muslims, Jews, agnostics, and atheists. And when they've gone to this festival, my students, regardless of their religious tradition, have been reduced to tears as well. Something happens when they see the devotion of the people and they experience something they cannot name, and they feel something that cannot be articulated. The church teaches that Mary is a saint, an intercessor, but is not to be worshipped. When you go to Malta, to the Festival of the Immaculate Conception, you find an experience of Mary being worshipped. It's not something I'm inventing, it's something I'm simply naming. You find the same thing in Hispanic churches in the United States. I happen to belong to a Hispanic parish in Chicago, in Pilsen, St. Pius V. And when you attend this parish on December the 12th, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, you will find the whole church packed with people even standing in the streets, bringing roses to lay before the statue. And they will keep vigil all night on the eve of the feast, and then attend liturgy throughout the night, in the morning, the next day, even the evening following. Having had a novena of 9 days before this, the celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe takes on greater importance than Easter or Christmas. Again, this is not something I am inventing, but something I'm naming, that somehow the divine feminine manifests herself through Mary to the people in Catholic settings. How to explain this? I believe that it's to be answered by psychology, perhaps, that we have a need to connect with this divine feminine, that each of us has a need to feel connected to a God who is compassionate, to a God who is nurturing and motherly. And sometimes the way God is named traditionally in Christianity, in Judaism, and in other traditions is of a God who is a judge, a God who is a God of war. And this way of naming does not produce endearment but fear. And so people gravitate instead to a softer image of the divine, one which offers comfort and protection. It is not that there is a God and a goddess, but rather a different way of encountering God through different imagery. Let me give you an example. I was once doing spiritual direction, and I was just starting out. It was probably the first person I'd ever worked with. She was Lutheran. She came in to see me. The minute the word God was sounded, and I think I did the sounding, the woman began to rock on her chair. And if I do a demonstration, you might see what would happen. She rocked on her chair, and the chair began moving across the room. By the time we'd got into our conversation, she was not only rocking on her chair, but banging her head on the wall. And the issue was that she was terrified of God because she was lesbian. I asked her, if you could design a God you're comfortable with, what would your God look like? And she stopped for a minute, and then she said, my God would look like a southwestern grandma. She would be wrinkled and brown and have me in her kitchen and make me bread and make me comfortable and give me tea and hug me, and I would feel loved. And that is the kind of God I can worship. So I said to her, if that is how you worship God, why don't you imagine your God like this? Because the images we have of God are merely conventions. The names we have for God are merely conventions. But the power of God is something you can access through imagery. And so if God is to you a grandma, wrinkled and brown from the southwest, image God that way and connect with God that way. It's not heretical. It's simply imagery as access. And that is all that imagery and naming is, because God is beyond all imagination, all imaging, all naming. And this is a truth acknowledged by Islam. This is a truth acknowledged by Hinduism. It is a truth acknowledged by Christianity, by Judaism, that God is beyond naming, beyond gender, and beyond all things.